Hey comic fans, Dave here at Ground Zero talking all things comics and all things comics history. And today I've got a particularly timely one for you because it was exactly 2 weeks ago as I filmed this that DC Comics dropped a bombshell announcement on the comic book industry. In fact, one that for whatever reason no one quite seemed to see coming. Turns out that right now, while Diamond Comic Distributors is shut down due to the COVID-19 outbreak, DC was making arrangements to ship some of their books via two alternate distributors. Those distributors were UCS and Lunar, and this quickly became the latest firestorm inside the industry. Why that is and what led to it is what I'm actually going to discuss in this installment of Interestingly Enough. Now, today's topic was actually suggested to us by nobody. So, unfortunately, none of you woke up this morning and said, man, I'd love to hear Dave talk about the history and inner workings of comic book distribution. But that's exactly what I'm going to do. This is the topic on everybody's lips. Now, don't worry, I'll try to have as much snark as I can to keep you with me for as long as possible. Now, the question is, how do we get to where we are now from where we were? Well, for the first 30 or 40 years, comic books were distributed just like every other magazine out there. Giant companies, giant magazine distribution companies would send big trucks to the printer, pick up the books, and carry them to giant warehouses where they'd sit and gather dust and mold until little smaller trucks came and took them to various newsstands, five and dimes, grocery stores, drugstores all across the area. Now, this was going to any place that comic books were sold, which at that time was a lot of different places. Now, guys that they called jobbers would carry in a big cardboard box full of magazines, and they would fill available spots. If there were any leftover spots in the comic book spinner rack that were empty, they'd just throw whatever comic books were in that box on them. So what this meant was Frogman number 17 might make it onto your local newsstand, but number 18 might not. It didn't matter. These were only comic books. Now, they were also, just like all the other magazines, sold on a returnable basis. What this meant was, once they'd been on the newsstand for a little while, whether it was a few weeks or a matter of months, they could rip the covers off and send them back to the publisher for credit. This meant that publishers had to print 300,000 copies of a book that they really intended to sell 150,000 copies of. They just had to absorb the cost of all that extra printing and all that extra materials. That's the way the industry worked. Well, this held fast for about 30, 40 years. We get to 1972 and a guy by the name of Phil Sealing. Now, Phil Sealing had organized some of the early comic book conventions and done other sorts of fandom-oriented things. Well, he had an idea that would change the comic book industry forever. He had started a company that he called Seagate Distribution. Now, for his company, he wanted to distribute comic books. So he went to 4 publishers and got them to agree to sell him their books at a much higher discount than what they were selling them to newsstands for. How did he get them to do this? Well, simple. He agreed to not return them. They were sold on a completely non-returnable basis. This was potentially a big deal because all that extra cost of extra printing was a major expense for the publishers. So, somewhat skeptically, 4 publishers agreed to these terms. Those were DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Archie Comics, who was still a pretty big player in the 70s, and Jim Warren's publishing house. Now, Warren Comics published Eerie and Creepy and Vampirella and lots of the other black and white magazines. So this was a pretty big deal, and all of a sudden Jim Warren could give better terms to what was now a new breed of specialty shop, the comic book store. And they started springing up across the U.S., introducing fanboys everywhere to that sweet, sweet aphrodisiac known as the smell of moldy paper. Okay, well, that held, and the industry started to slowly grow. It turns out, though, that Phil Sealing had what would amount to a monopoly for about 5 or 6 years, until 1978. 1978, Urjax Enterprises brought legal action against all the parties involved, both publishers and Phil Sealing and everybody, saying this is not fair, we want in on the action. And they won. This opened up for all sorts of distributors to now function in various regional areas and opened up the comic book industry. There was a lot of growth during this time. Now, however, we're going to skip back just a little bit, back to the early 70s, and a guy by the name of Ivan Snyder. Now, Ivan Snyder was the head of licensing at Marvel Comics for a time. But they had a lot of regime changes there. Every time somebody would buy the company or there'd be some sort of change, there would be all sorts of personnel that would be axed. And this was one of those times, probably when Perfect Film and Chemical had taken over. So, new regime change comes in. Ivan Snyder gets the axe, but he gets an unusual severance package. They give him $39,000 worth of Marvel toys. Now, they either give them to him outright or they give them to him at cost. It depends on what store you hear. But either way, he went home with a lot of stuff that he put in his garage, and he started a mail order company called Superhero Enterprises. Now, he ultimately started out with just Marvel stuff, but then he got DC stuff and all sorts of things. So he was selling t-shirts, toys, posters, what we would euphemistically call junk. Now, he did this and ultimately started a chain of stores, and he had several stores on the East Coast. Superhero Enterprises was doing pretty well with their mail order catalog. I had some of these as a kid. It was the only place you could buy plastic superhero stuff that would break just about the second time you pulled them out of the box. But that could be a treasure during that period. Well, why are you thinking to yourself, but I don't remember Superhero Enterprises? Well, there's a story there, because there was also a company by the name of Mego. Now, Mego was doing action figures. They were cheap action figures that used rubber bands in the joints, and they had a tendency to break and fall apart very quickly. However, they were cheap, so they sold a lot of them. And they had characters from DC Comics license, characters from Marvel Comics license. All was fine. But then at some point, somebody noticed they had done something that maybe bothered them just a little bit. Their line was called World's Greatest Superheroes, and they trademarked it. That meant they had a trademark on the name Superheroes. DC and Marvel got real nervous at this, and they put the squeeze on Mego. You can't keep this trademark. So Mego backed down and let the trademark go, and then DC and Marvel together trademarked the word superheroes. All variations of it, superhero, superheroes, with a hyphen, without a hyphen, any way that one's done, if it's a trademark, it belongs to those two companies. So, Superhero Enterprises had to change their name because it couldn't be trademarked. And they changed it to Heroes World. Okay, well, it was a good time for Urjax to have sued and got the comic book industry to open up, because the 70s was where it really kind of started to grow. In 1974, there was somewhere between 200 and 300 shops. But by 1980, there was 1,500 shops. Lots of new retailers had sprung up across the U.S. One of those was a guy by the name of Steve Geppi. Now, Steve Geppi had a chain of stores in the Baltimore area called Geppi's Comic World. Okay, he was also sub-distributing, and he was the biggest remaining customer for Urjax Enterprises, which is significant because in 1981, towards the very end of the year, Urjax Enterprises filed Chapter 11. Well, this led the way for ultimately Geppi to start his own distributor and take over all the warehouses and some of the infrastructure that was left over from Urjax. So interestingly enough, the company that initially brought legal action to break up the existing monopoly in direct market distribution became Diamond Comics. Okay, so the 80s, y'all know, I love the 80s and blah, 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 but that was a time of consolidation. Lots of distributors came around, but then small distributors got eaten up by big distributors, and by the time you get to the 90s, there's only a few. There's two particularly big ones, Diamond Comics and Capital City. Those are the two major national players. And then a handful of regional distributors. One of those regional distributors is now Heroes World. Heroes World had gotten into distributing comics in addition to all the other things they were doing. Now, it was the third largest distributor, but by a pretty distant margin, because it was still a regional distributor, whereas Diamond and Capital City were national. Now, the biggest comic book company is a no-brainer. It was Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics was far and away the most popular. They absolutely drove the industry. And that's how we get into the 90s. Now, in 1991, Marvel Comics accounted for 47.5% of all the comic books sold. That is just almost half of everything sold was Marvel Comics. However, by 1994, that number had dropped. We've discussed it in other installments. The collapse of the 90s, the competition, things like Image, and Valiant exploding, and more independent publishers coming along. So, as we get to 1994, Marvel's got big plans. They've got plans for all their books, but more importantly, they've got plans for the business. And on December 28th of 1994, they announced they had acquired Heroes World, and they intended for Heroes World to serve as their distributor. Well, collectively, the industry lost its poop. They were worried about exactly what was about to happen. And sure enough, what they were worried about did, in fact, exactly happen. In fact, it was 25 years ago from just a day or two from now, May 3rd, 25 years ago, they announced Heroes World would be the exclusive distributor for everything Marvel published. It would be the only place you could get their books. Now, this was a pretty big deal. And, I'd like to say, certainly don't want to say that it was an unmitigated disaster. Except it was unquestionably an unmitigated disaster. Their infrastructure was simply not designed to handle all the new accounts they were going to have to deal with to deal on a national basis. They were still a fairly small regional distributor. Their computer system couldn't handle all the new accounts. They had problems from the very, very beginning. On the first week they sent comics out, they knew they were going to have lots of problems coming back because they were still so new at getting this stuff packed. So they installed a brand new phone and phone system, and they put it in a room that had no ventilation. It overheated and crashed immediately, and their phones were down for 3 weeks. This meant comic book shops, like yours truly, would get their shipment of stuff, and it wouldn't have, say, X-Men or something equally significant, and we would call Heroes World, and we would not be able to get through, and we would not be able to get through the next day, or the day after that, or the week after that. It was an absolute nightmare. Now, it also set a domino effect inside the industry because Marvel still accounted for a major chunk of the business that these distributors were doing. So promptly, the two main next distributors, Diamond and Capital City, started scrambling for their own exclusives. Quickly, DC signed with Diamond Comics. Okay, so everybody thought Image and Valiant and Dark Horse and some of those would then probably sign with Capital City, and we would have a certain amount of parity in the industry. But that's not what happened. Image, and then Dark Horse, and then Valiant all signed with Diamond. This meant that Diamond had the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth largest publishers all at that time. That left almost nothing for Capital City. Capital City settled for Viz and Kitchen Sink. Now, I love me some Spirit, so nothing against Kitchen Sink, but it was definitely like taking the ugly girl to the prom. Yeah, it was a terrible time for Capital City because all while this was happening for both Heroes World and Capital City, the comic industry was crashing. It was falling apart all around them. So with so little to hold up their business, Capital City did the best they could. But in July of 1996, Capital City was acquired by Diamond. And honestly, this was kind of a mercy act on Diamond's part because Capital City was simply not going to survive with what little business was left. Now that was in July of 96. 5 months later, Heroes World goes because Marvel Comics declares bankruptcy. They file Chapter 11. There's a 5-part series on all the stuff that happened in the 90s. But suffice to say, they had so much debt, they had no choice but to liquidate what they could, and Heroes World was going to shut its doors. And in fact, reportedly, the biggest debt that Marvel Comics had was $1.7 million to Disney. So, Marvel Comics does the only thing they can do. They go back to Diamond. And this meant essentially Diamond was the only game in town. They had what would be a monopoly. Now, was this allowed to stay? Well, yeah, it was, because honestly, the comic industry had shrunk so much at that point that there really wasn't enough business to divide up among any major players. So this held for about 20 years. And then along came a pandemic. You might have heard of it. Well, during the pandemic, in March 24th, Diamond announced they were shutting down, at least temporarily. It simply was not good business sense for anybody concerned for them to ship out books to stores that were closed. So many stores across the nation were already closed in areas that had stay-at-home orders, and those that were in areas that didn't have that yet were predicted to have them soon. If you were anywhere but Oklahoma, at some point you were going to have to be closed. So they simply couldn't keep shipping out books to stores that weren't there to receive them. So most people felt like this was probably the smartest thing to do. Apparently, except for DC. Now, turns out that the exclusive agreement DC had with Diamond Comics had by this point lapsed. So, on April 17th, DC announced that they were going to use 2 alternate distributors to get their books in the hands of comic shops that wanted to sell them, and more importantly, comic fans. Those distributors, they said, were UCS and Lunar. To which comic shop said, "We've never heard of them. Who are these guys?" Well, What DC kind of failed to mention to us is who these guys were Midtown Comics and DCBS, the two major mail-order online discount comic services. These were, for all practical purposes, our competition. So the collective industry lost its poop. Even more than that, DC announced in the same announcement that also all of your April product with Diamond has been canceled. We lost our poop again. This was panic. So all of a sudden, you mean our major competition, the mail order places, are going to be taking these books and supposedly shipping to us when most of us aren't even open? So why was this such a thing? Because quickly, all the major players inside the comic industry, especially the retailers, Buddy Sanders, Brian Hibbs, immediately spoke out against this and said it was a terrible idea. Well, for a handful of reasons. One is these are mail order giants. They are a comic book shop's competition. It is a conflict of interest, more so than you might even be thinking. Let's say a particularly hot comic comes out. The next issue of Batman has the reveal of Punchline or something particularly big. Comic shop saying, great, I need to order a lot more copies of this. Well, surprise, you can't get them, because why should DCBS or any of these companies send them to us? Because they're sending them direct to their mail order customers. That's the whole point of a conflict of interest. Second, they were shipping books out in April to stores that weren't open. Now, this made a real uneven playing field for those shops in California or in all these other places, New York, that could not be open. It meant that their customers couldn't get these new books that were coming out, which then sent them deliberately to Midtown and DCBS. That also was a problem. You know, these things all combined just had a lot of issues. Now, as for the announcement that all their orders have been canceled through Diamond, well, Diamond said, no, they're not. Those books are still sitting in our warehouse. We still have them. So it was absolute chaos for a couple of weeks. Well, finally, Diamond announced they were going to resume shipments on May 20th. May 20th, we'll start getting all our books back in. Now, I actually watched a couple of other people's videos get to this, and they all said much the same thing. Is this Heroes World 2.0? No, it's absolutely not. It's completely different. Well, yeah, it is. It's completely different if your definition of completely different is not completely the same, because it's not completely the same. DC did not buy these distributors. They don't own them, so it's not like Heroes World situation in that respect. And there's some other things that are very different. However, what it is introducing chaos into an already chaotic situation. I mean, basically, comic shops are already reeling from all the hits they have taken from basically some slack times in the industry over the last couple of years anyway, to now a COVID outbreak that has had them shut down for weeks and possibly months at a time, to now dealing with this extra situation. It was awful. Now, breaking monopoly, yes, it's a good idea. There's no reason for Diamond to have a monopoly in this, and I don't think that is a particularly bad situation. But now is not the time. The introduction of chaos into a market like it exists right now is just causing more problems. When Heroes World went out of business in the 90s, it took a lot of comic shops with it. Hopefully, that won't be what happens here, but understand a lot of shops are reeling. They are fighting for their lives right now in a market that has taken some huge, huge hits. Now, shops are your front line. I've seen, there's this thing called the internet, and so every time people have talked about it, I see comments and I read those comments, and if you're not reading comments, let me give you some advice, and don't, because it will shatter your faith in humanity. And a common comment is, well, A, everybody should have all their stuff online anyway, and B, monopolies are bad. Well, okay, on the latter part, yes, monopolies are bad. But as far as everybody having their stuff online anyway, there is plenty online. Your local comic shop is your last line of defense against digital publishing and online retailing. And they're fighting for their survival. This is something that we don't want to see happen, or at least cause extra problems on them. Because if that does, it could make every fanboy's worst nightmare a reality. And that is the extinction of that sweet, sweet aphrodisiac, the moldy paper smell. Well, I promised this would be under the 20 minutes of last time, and it looks like I'm not quite going to make it. Guys, I want to leave you with one thought. Wherever you're at, whatever your government has done lately, please think of this. Your government is not the one responsible for your health and safety. That responsibility falls to you. So no matter where you're at, no matter what your government is allowing you to do or not allowing you to do, you need yourself make good choices. Guys, We love you. We want you back. We want everybody healthy, and we want an industry that survives. So bear that in mind and come back to your local shop wherever it may be. Guys, I appreciate you spending the time with us. Thanks very much.